Welcome to Chapter 6, Systems Thinking and Asset Mapping. In this chapter, you will gain an understanding of complex systems and their presence in the urban environment. We will explore ways in which you can influence those systems to bring about broad, holistic, and sustainable change to your city on behalf of marginalized and vulnerable people groups. You will also be introduced to asset mapping exercises and the asset-based approach to community development, identifying institutions, individuals, citizens, associations, and other resources that reside within your community, along with how to activate these identified resources. We will hear from experts in system thinking and have several community development lessons where we learn asset mapping strategies. You'll be provided with tools that can be used to see the abundance of good works within your community and how to link them, as well as where holes and gaps might be. Asset mapping gives us a bottoms-up or local structure approach for decision-making within our city and allows us to involve and engage the whole community in our approach.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Del Rio. I'm with Thrive Collective and the New York City Leadership Foundation. It is a delight to be with you all today to present this workshop on systems thinking, seeing differently, the journey to openness. First, for some context and by way of a little introduction, I am the co-founder and executive director of Thrive Collective in New York City. We create hope and opportunity through arts, sports, and mentoring in and around New York City public schools. The nature of our work requires us to think systemically about public education, about youth development work, about community youth development work. And on a regular basis, we interact with many different city agencies, including, of course, the Department of Education, but also the Department of Cultural Affairs. This photograph is of a building in the New York City Housing Authority with artwork that our students and seniors produced. And so we've had a lifetime, really, of navigating multiple public systems on a regular basis. So the work that we do on the ground in New York very much is going to inform our workshop today. But obviously the content itself is not specific to New York City. Here's a photograph of a number of our students, actually opposite the previous image. This is at a school in the Lower East Side called the Island School. And when Nickelodeon called us to see if there was a school in Manhattan that needed our programs but couldn't afford them because SpongeBob wanted to donate a visual arts program in honor of his 20th anniversary, we connected the dots immediately and recommended the Island School. SpongeBob lives under the sea. This particular school is nestled in the middle of a public housing project, one of the oldest public housing projects in the country. And over 45% of the students at the school live in homeless shelters. And so it was an obvious choice. These are some of the students and some of the faculty of the school, as well as representatives from Nickelodeon, on the day that we dedicated this particular mural project. In terms of our expectations for the workshop, I want you to take a moment and hit pause on the video and just kind of jot down the expectations you're bringing to this experience, right? The first rule of leadership, of course, is to begin with the end in mind. I think it's important before we begin for you to define how you'll know you didn't waste your time watching this systems thinking workshop here online. And so if you could just hit the pause button and jot it down. I'm going to explain my expectations for the workshop. We will explore 5 big ideas as it relates to systems thinking. The first is the necessity to see the whole. If we want to be a systems thinker, it means we're going to commit to understanding the big picture before we focus on a particular challenge or opportunity. The second big idea, if you want to effectively engage systems, is the importance of collective intelligence, right? Understanding what is true about a situation requires multiple points of view, not just our own, and that necessitates engaging the larger community and understanding collectively what's going on in relationship to the issue that we're trying to understand. The third big idea is recognizing that in a system that is interlocking and comprised of many components, often the system's issues we contribute to ourselves. And so if we want to be truthful as it relates to the issues that we observe, we have to be willing to acknowledge our own contribution at times and responsibility, not just for creating the problem, but the opportunity to find the solution. And so the third big idea is overcoming self-deception and the importance of getting out of the box in order to resolve our own contributions to the system's issues. The fourth big idea is the importance of shared vision, right? If we're talking again about an interlocking web of variables and factors and issues that impact entire communities, right? It's important for the community to create the future together, to develop a shared vision and commit together to manifest that vision and demonstrate it in the real world we all share. The fifth and final big idea that we'll cover in our workshop is how we create healthy change and enact that future together, right? The importance of working again in an interdependent community in order to manifest the change we hope to see in the world. So those are the big ideas that will anchor our time together. Before we dive into the first big idea, though, we want to ground our conversation in a theological understanding of what we mean by systems. And believe it or not, there are biblical roots that inform how we think about the whole, right? An example of this is found in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 32, the description of the men of Issachar, right? The people of one of the tribes of Israel were known for understanding the times and knowing what Israel should do, right? The people of Issachar particularly had a sense of the big picture. And because of the understanding of the big picture, all the nuances, the contextualized dynamics of that particular time and place, they were able to discern a path forward, not only for themselves or their own individual families or community, but for the entire country. And there's a giftedness that comes with that level of discernment that benefits the larger community and not just our own selfish ends. A second example is in Genesis chapter 50, verses 20 and 21, when Joseph is reflecting on his time in captivity, and he's actually identified himself to his brothers after many, many years apart, after they had sold him into slavery. And he says to them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many people." Right? Joseph had a sense of the big picture. Even as a teenager, when he first had the dreams and he lacked the self-awareness maybe to figure out who and when and how to share the contents of those dreams. But from that time until this time that we're reading in chapter 50, Joseph was able to understand that there was more at play than what was right in front of him. He had a sense of the big picture, both thinking forward and here now reflecting backward, right? He understood that even though he was the victim of an awful injustice, that in a much bigger sense, he was exactly where God wanted him to be. And overcoming that injustice was part of the delivery and the salvation of the entire region of the world during this unprecedented famine that they survived because of his leadership. And he had the savvy not only to understand that, but because of that, to offer forgiveness and grace to his brothers, even though they didn't deserve it. Systems thinking is also about understanding that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, but often those reactions are reactions we could not anticipate, right? The phenomenon of the unintended consequence. So often in life, we deal with the fruit of these unintended consequences, right? The pain and the suffering of individuals, of families, of neighborhoods, of cities, of countries. And somebody's got to deal with the brokenness that results. Systems thinkers embrace that opportunity and indeed that responsibility. There are two main components of an after action review. The first component is when you think backwards, right? When you reflect on your intentions. What did we set out to do? But then we don't stop with the good intentions. We look at the actual results. What actually transpired as a result of what we did. But then we consider the gap, right? The distance between our intentions and the results. Why did our actual results differ from our intention, right? We identify the gap, but then we consider the why. What happened that produced this very different result than what we expected? And then finally, what lessons can we take away from this gap, right? What did we learn that can help us in the future? And after action review, though, doesn't just stop by looking backward. It also allows us to look forward, right? Taking those lessons learned, understanding the gap that resulted, how can we move forward together, right? Unfortunately, we can't bottle up the pain of our bad decisions or our unintended consequences. There are other people that are impacted directly. And so moving forward requires buy-in from everybody who was involved, not just the doers, but the beneficiaries or not beneficiaries of the action. And so what is the shared vision that's going to drive us moving forward together? And then finally, how do we make that tangible and actionable right now? What are the next steps that we must do to bring that shared vision to life? Sometimes the shared vision, in order to get to that place in the future, we have to begin by acknowledging the shortcoming, owning it, repenting of it, allowing time to heal together, in order to have the space to imagine where we're headed next. That picture, I think, is best summed up in Romans chapter 12, a familiar passage for many of us, particularly verse 2. Do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Notice that he doesn't tell us to transform ourselves, right? The process of transformation is not the activity. The transformation, according to Romans 12:2, is the byproduct of becoming different, of being different. When we rush from seeing different to doing different and we bypass being different, any difference we see is going to be fleeting, because fundamentally we're still the same person. We're just following a gimmick. We're just being conformed to somebody else's pattern, right? We're aligning ourselves for the short term to somebody else's best practice. And that's not sustainable. When we internalize the best practice, and the best practice fundamentally changes who we are as a person, then the change is sustainable. And transformation moves from an aspiration or an ideal to a demonstrated reality, a lived experience. For us as leaders in our communities, it's that lived experience that gives hope for significant change, right? Revelation says we overcome the enemy by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. The power of our lived experience is what gives the words we say a deeper level of meaning. When people see that, they want to press into that. But for us, as we are being transformed in this way, then we'll be able to test and approve his will. As leaders, we're in search of his will for our communities, his will for our people, his will for our families, his will for our lives, right? We want to be good stewards of what he's blessed us with. This is the path forward. To understand his good, pleasing, and perfect will requires this commitment to a renewed mind, right? The kind of renewal that fundamentally changes who we are, so that transformation is the byproduct, the natural byproduct of this changed person. So our prayer as we embark on a journey towards systems thinking is take my heart and form it, take my mind, transform it, take my will, conform it to yours, Lord. With that said, we're going to transition now to the first big idea, right? There's obviously a biblical frame for this. We've just introduced some of those ideas. There's lots more where that came from, but we're going to transition now to this first big idea, which is if we want to be a systems thinker, we have to be committed to the big picture. Seeing the whole, the best metaphor for this is the iceberg metaphor, right? We've all used the iceberg metaphor in many different contexts. It's something that it's almost become cliche. Movies like Titanic, stories like Titanic have informed the pop consciousness. And so people talk about the tip of the iceberg on a regular basis without actually considering the applicability of the iceberg to our lives. For systems thinkers, here's an application of the iceberg metaphor. The tip of the iceberg is the event, right? It's the occasion that creates hardship for somebody, right? When we encounter that event, as leaders, our responsibility right from the beginning is to figure out, is this a one-off? Is it an exception? Or is it a pattern, right? Have there been more than one event like this? Is the hardship that is being caused, is the success that's being experienced a complete fluke? Is it the result of some, perfect alignment of the stars and it's a total one-off, never to be replicated again? Or is this something that is happening more than once? And to the extent it is, what can we learn from it, right? If it happens more than once, now we have a pattern. We can still see patterns. We have to dig a little deeper, right? We might have to step back from the emotion and the heat of the particular event. It might take a day or two or 5 or 20 to figure out, wait, I've seen this before. This is not the first time I've encountered this. But even the patterns are at the surface level, right? We know there's a pattern because we've seen multiple events. When we identify a pattern, the question is, okay, what's causing this to transpire? We dig a little deeper below the surface now, and we find that there are structures that are producing these events with a level of frequency that allow us to discern a pattern, right? You've heard the cliche, we're perfectly designed to get the results that we're getting. So looking deeper begins by identifying what's the structure that's supporting this result, right? The structure might be organizational, the structure might be our time management. The structure might be how something is staffed. The structure might be our relationship with our neighbors. There's so many different structures, which might be physical, or they might be organizational, or they might be metaphorical, but there are these structures that are allowing for these results to take place. The structures are built and supported by mental models, right? What do we mean by mental models? Mental models are how we think about the world. If we think that something is bad, then we create structures to protect ourselves from that bad thing. If we think that something is good, we create structures to support and satisfy that good thing, right? It begins not with the structure. The structure doesn't just emerge out of the air. The structure is predicated on certain thoughts and assumptions and beliefs that we have about the world that allow us to organize our life or organize our time in support of that thing. Underlying the mental model, right, the thoughts we have about the thing, is a vision for the world. A vision for the world, a vision for our life, a vision for our neighborhood, a vision for our organization, whatever that vision might be. The problem is, for a lot of us, our vision's very murky. The vision's very cloudy. We can't even, it's been so long since we thought about the future because we've been overwhelmed by the present, or we've been grieving the past, or we've been stuck in the tensions of life. So the vision becomes cloudy and murky, that all we focus on is what we see above the surface. And we forget that what we see above the surface is a manifestation of this bigger vision for the world that we've embarked on in our lives. Systems thinking says, I'm going to commit to looking deeper than the event. The event is the trigger. The event is the thing that causes the pain, or the thing that reminds us the pain never healed in the first place, right? The event is at that top level. A systems thinker is going to have the discipline to take a step back from that momentary instinct to consider, is this a one-off or is it a pattern? If it's a pattern, what's the structure supporting the pattern? What's the structure based on in terms of our thoughts, our priorities, our resource allocations, right? All the mental models that create the structure, and then understanding that those mental models support a vision, whether we believe it or not, or understand it or make the connection or not. There is a vision for the world that the mental models are fueling. So let's define it a little bit more precisely, right? We have this commitment to understanding the big picture, to seeing the nuance and the layers of the iceberg. The systems are the things that are connected that create our circumstances. The system is the things, or are, I should say, the things, because it's many things that are connected to each other that create the circumstances in our lives. If you think about a shelter, a home that we live in, right? The home that we live in that provides us with shelter and, to whatever degree, a level of security and kind of a safe space to unwind and be replenished, right? That home is comprised of walls, roofs, flooring, paints, insulation, electricity, plumbing, so many different components that are connected in a way that creates not only shelter from the elements outside, but if it's designed well, right, it's going to create a place of relief and sanctuary and wholeness, replenishment, that inform the circumstances of our everyday lives. Human systems are interconnected webs of relationships that influence how systems work. The system doesn't self-manifest. The system doesn't operate it's not artificial intelligence, that's kind of manifesting its own thing, although AI is a new expression of a system, right? But it doesn't come independent of the human agents that imagine it, that create it, that maintain it, that fuel it, that sustain it. Those relationships, the human elements, influence how the system actually works. It doesn't work itself. Another biblical metaphor is 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 14 through 26. We see the metaphor here in this passage, but it's actually introduced in several other passages as well. It's a metaphor that comes up repeatedly throughout the scriptures. But the 1 Corinthians version of it describes the human body as comprised of many interlocking parts, right? Now, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason cease to be part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason cease to be part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has arranged the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and the parts that we think are less honorable we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has combined the members of the body and has given greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have an equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. If I may be so bold, I want to tell you when this passage became real to me. About 20 years ago, my infant son was sleeping in the next room. I was getting ready for work, and I stubbed my toe on the bedpost, right? His mother was sleeping in the bed, my wife, and I didn't want to wake her. And so I suppressed every instinct to scream and dance and move because I stubbed my toe. I snuck out of the room and I looked down, and immediately the little toe on my right foot had started to swell and the foot started to discolor. It turned out I broke my toe that morning on the bedpost. Truthfully, I don't remember the last time I thought about my pinky toe, right? Obviously basic hygiene, I wash it, I clip my toenails, but other than the basics, I never think, I'm not waking up in the morning looking in the mirror to see how my pinky toe looks, right? I cover it with a sock and it goes in a shoe and it helps to maintain my balance, and I don't think about it again, typically throughout the day. But that morning, every part of my body felt the impact of the bedpost when my toe crunched up against it that morning, right? This little immodest part, or vulnerable part, right? That was something I don't consider. Suddenly, every part of my body felt the pain. And it was the body's way of telling me immediately that something wrong happened and I needed to pay attention to the pain in order to fix the wrong immediately, right? All of the body had a concern in that moment for whatever was causing the pain on my pinky toe, right? That's a picture of how a system works. Biblically, for us as leaders in communities, we have to be considering not just the parts that are most visible, not just the parts that get all the attention, not just the parts that speak the most eloquently or loudly that we can miss, right? But all the other parts, if the system is going to be functioning optimally. Systems thinking then is about understanding how things are connected, how they create our circumstances, and how we can achieve change. Systems thinking is about understanding how things are connected. Not just the fact that they are connected, but how they connect to one another, right? It's in the connections that they create our circumstances. How those connections impact the circumstances around us is important if we're going to be effective as leaders and determine how we can achieve real change. We all can see and sense when something's wrong, but until we have an understanding of how we got to that point, we're not going to be able to impact it. We're just going to have to deal with it. And unfortunately, if we tolerate the wrong for too long, it can become cancerous and obviously cause deeper level of pain and trauma. So what are the basics? If you want to understand a system, you have to know that every system has a purpose. There is a purpose to the system, right? The pinky toe exists not on its own, but it's part of a skeletal system, and more specifically, part of a foot that, when it's crafted well and maintained, allows for balance, allows for mobility, allows for the capacity to stand up and to keep on standing and to function throughout the day. There is a purpose to the skeleton that provides structure and strength and stability that toe is part of. The parts combine in a particular way in order to carry out the purpose, right? That pinky toe is not floating in some obscure manner, but it's directly connected to other bones, other parts, not just bones, but muscles and tendons, and in order for that purpose to be realized. Systems serve specific purposes within larger systems. The skeletal system of the body is not the only system of the body, right? It's connected to the muscles, it's connected to the blood supply, it's connected to the nerve endings. It was the nervous system that put every other body part on high alert when my toe crunched the bedpost. The nervous system was the trigger to tell every other body part that some definitive immediate action needed to be taken in order to minimize the pain I was experiencing. It was this combination of systems that allows for our bodies to function. The fourth basic is that systems seek stability. And finally, systems have feedback. That moment of impact destabilized the skeletal system, and more particularly the functioning of my foot, right? That destabilization caused this feedback loop to kick into high alert. That metaphor is not unique to the human body, but it exists in our neighborhoods, in our homes, in our schools every single day. There is a goal for the system. The parts combine in a particular way to carry out the purpose. Individual systems can be part of larger systems. All systems are seeking stability, and all systems have feedback loops. If we're going to discern how to impact the circumstances that the system creates, we have to understand these basics and how they connect. Understanding requires us to think beyond linear thinking, right? Too often we think that, that circumstances are created in this linear, easy to follow pathway. But sometimes A doesn't cause B. A and B are just neighbors, right? And A contributes to W, but it doesn't contribute to B or to C or to X or to Z, right? And so we have to recognize that complex problems have often complex causes. And when we oversimplify the problems, when we exaggerate our claims in order to make a point, what we end up doing is misdiagnosing the cause and alienating the people that are impacted. We don't want to misdiagnose the problem, and we don't want to alienate the people that can be the solution to the problem and will most benefit from the solution to the problems, right? We need to be willing to take a step back, to look beyond the oversimplified linear logic and embrace the fact that there are multiple things at play, and I need to understand those things in order to arrive at a transformational solution to the problem. So how does a system work? There are two basic processes that drive activities in systems. There are the reinforcing processes and then the balancing processes. The reinforcing processes might be positive or they might be negative, right? And the phrases that describe them are so familiar, they become cliche. So we have to pause for a minute and consider what they look like, right? A positive reinforcing process, those are the virtuous cycles. The negative ones, those are the vicious cycles. It's probably easier for us to identify vicious cycles because they're so common and painful. And so we see it at work, right? A vicious cycle when somebody is struggling with drug addiction or codependency, or we see the school to prison pipeline and all of these things that we know are connected, but we don't necessarily understand how to change them, right? So the school to prison pipeline, the fact that public policy, criminal justice experts anticipate prison populations based on third grade reading scores. They know there's a connection, that if third grade reading scores drop below a certain percentage, they can forecast with some degree of predictability what that means for crime rates. And then depending on how they want to deal with crime, they determine how many beds they have to budget for in the future for the prison system, right? That's an example of a vicious cycle. Without intervention in changing the third grade reading scores, they can anticipate that 10, 20 years from now, they will need X number of beds in the prison system to accommodate all of the people that were unable to get a good job and therefore more likely to end up in extracurricular income producing activities, right? And so there's a vicious cycle as play. A virtuous cycle, we've all seen that too. When somebody begins, for example, to eat right and they're making healthy food choices, they don't have to worry about their weight. The weight starts taking care of itself, right? Because they get in the rhythm and the routine of eating certain ways or doing certain physical activities, and they don't have to obsess over the scale as much as they used to, because that virtuous cycle produces the health results that they're looking for, right? We see these examples. There's so many other examples, but where a process, either a positive or a negative process, produces results, and the people that are benefiting or being impacted from the results don't even have to work hard to manufacture the results. It just kind of takes care of itself. The other process, those are harder to identify. They're the balancing process. They're the intervention, right? The change that's going to dramatically impact the school to prison pipeline, right? The intervention on third grade reading results that's going to ensure more students are educated at a level that's going to produce realistic job prospects in their future, right? Those processes are harder to identify, but they are balancing process because they come in where there's that imbalance, where the cycle's just kind of taking care of itself, and they create an intervention that helps to recalibrate the results. They're a little bit harder to identify. Often, right, those if you want to find the balancing process, it begins by identifying a capacity limit, right? The capacity limit that is causing this cycle to kind of live on its own, because that capacity limitation hasn't been overcome, right? So thinking back to the school to prison pipeline metaphor, the capacity limit is we are getting, our public schools are systematically underperforming students in certain communities, in certain neighborhoods. We have all the statistics and the data to confirm that. We're trying to figure out why. We don't understand why it is that 4 generations, every president since Lyndon Johnson has made reforming public schools a core platform in their domestic agenda, and yet we haven't seen significant movement on those third grade reading results in certain neighborhoods. There are capacity limits that are there. When we can identify what the limits are, we can take action, right, to bolster the capacity that was causing the problem in the first place. If we misdiagnose what's creating that capacity limit, or we're chasing a certain policy position, or we're being conformed to the trends of the day and not really considering the larger systemic issues, we're addressing wrong capacity issues. We're not creating the balancing loop that's going to change the reinforcing action long enough, the reinforcing cycle, to produce the desired result, right? Those capacity limits, identifying them, diagnosing them, understanding not only what's causing them, but how they're impacting the other parts of the system. That's the job of leaders in our communities. We're all serving in our communities because we recognize capacity limits, and we feel called, we feel equipped, we feel set apart to be good news in that circumstance, to bring about change to that circumstance, right? And so in respect to that circumstance, we have to understand the system if we're going to be able to diagnose properly what's causing the limitation and be able to address it and overcome it. To summarize, the systems iceberg begins by acknowledging the event above the surface, determining, is that event an isolated instance or is it part of a larger pattern? If it's part of a larger pattern, understanding the structures that are creating that pattern. Once we've identified the structures, understanding the big ideas, the mental models, the philosophies, the beliefs, the assumptions on which the structures have been built, and then digging even deeper, perceiving the larger vision that we have that we're working towards, right? And that larger vision might need to be changed. And that's where collective insight, shared vision, all of those things come into play. That's the first big idea, right? Are we committed to the big picture? And if we are, understanding the basics, of the system, understanding the connections, and based on that commitment, being willing to take a step back from that triggering event to figure out what's causing it and how we respond in a way that produces the desired change that we're after. Big idea number 2, collective intelligence. It starts from a place of humility. I'm not smart enough to understand all the nuance. I'm not smart enough to understand the components. I'm not experienced enough or expert enough to make all the connections on my own. And so am I committed to mining the intelligence of the larger community that I'm serving, that I'm part of, that I'm called to, right? And if I am, then we together will get at the truth a lot more effectively than if I'm trying to discern it all by myself. Biblically, 1 Corinthians 13, right? So right after that body metaphor, we transition to the chapter on love. And in this chapter on love, which, by the way, 1 Corinthians, as you know, is a letter Paul is writing to a church that is the best of times and the worst of times all in the same church. On the one hand, they're experiencing the power of God in miraculous ways. They've got huge faith, rapid growth. You know, on the surface, they appear to be a success story, but just below the surface, they are fractured. They can't figure out how to resolve personal conflict. There are these personality clashes. And Paul recognizes that this deeper dysfunction will erode what's happening above the surface if they don't get at it. And so most of the letter is about how do you bring order and structure and peace to a community that is fractured by conflict, right? The body metaphor is part of that search for understanding. And then 13 is this introduction on love. He didn't write it to be read at weddings. He's writing it as a roadmap for a dysfunctional church to find itself in community and resolve conflict and become one. And there's this transitional verse, right? The first 2/3 of the chapter is this poetry about what love is. And then verse 12 has this bridge. It says, "For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known." Right? There's this acknowledgement of our insufficiency, right? There's this humility embedded in this statement, which says, if I'm going to love people well, I must acknowledge that I am not smart enough to understand their experience better than they do, right? I am not smart enough to be able to discern their skill, their perspective, their insight better than they can. At most, I can commit to understanding my experience with the help of a larger community, right? I can commit to cultivating my skills, using my time wisely with the help of a larger community. But even that I can't do fully. And so when I start with that humility, I'm only seeing a part. At best, I can glimpse what's really going on here. Then I can commit to this kind of collective vision of the world that's rooted in love, that invites other people to speak in and open up my capacity for understanding. Our thinking goes bad when we stop recognizing that we don't know it all, right? It isn't what we don't know that gives us trouble. It's what we know that ain't so. The great humorist Will Rogers and social commentator has the insight that what we don't know isn't our problem. It's all the stuff that we think is true and we're insistent on and we're beholden to, we're stubbornly grasping at, that really isn't true, right? Or at best, it's partly true. And when we get so myopic and devoted to these impartial truths, that's when our relationships sour. That's when our political economy suffers, right? That's when the society and the promise of freedom is eroded. Albert Einstein put it like this: the significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them, right? Albert Einstein notes that the problems we face in society didn't just evolve. They didn't happen out of thin air, right? Social issues are created by social beings who are interacting socially in social systems. And if we only bring the same level of thinking that predated the problem will never go away. We have to commit to learning why this circumstance is so different than what we set out to achieve if we hope to change the circumstance. And if we're not committed to a new level of thinking, the only thing we can expect is no change or an erosion backwards, but not an evolution forward. Eric Hoffer, another social commentator, says it like this: in times of turbulence, it is the learners who inherit the future. The knowers usually find themselves equipped to live in a world that no longer exists. When we embrace the fact that we don't know it all, right, we open up the possibility of seeing past our blind spots. If you didn't know it, we all have a blind spot. The blind spot is biological. The way our eyes are designed, we can only see but so far in our peripheral vision. And the minute we move past that peripheral vision, we can't see. We can't see behind us. We can't see to the side of us. And if we think we know everything just because we can see what we can see, then inevitably we're vulnerable, right? We're vulnerable to accidents. We're vulnerable to missteps. We're vulnerable to attackers, right? And if we don't mitigate against the blind spots, then our effectiveness is going to be marred by all of the vulnerabilities that create pain and frustration for everybody who knows and loves us, including ourselves. Our ability to focus is limited to a certain range of vision. If we want to mitigate beyond and open our vision beyond that limited range, it requires us to engage other people, to leverage other technology, to be able to see beyond our blind spot. This illustration is fun because it gives voice to or paints a picture of what we're talking about, right? This enterprising adventurer, inventor, engineer, whatever, has this contraption rigged, and he doesn't realize that the minute he lets go, he's going to initiate a chain of events that's going to cause himself great harm. But there's this friend off in a distance who spots the harm, who's able to advise him to slow down, change his position, and not be harmed. That kind of collective intelligence does not happen apart from inviting other people, giving them explicit permission to help us see what we don't see, right? Collective intelligence begins with humility, but the humility extends itself to say, I'm going to trust you I'm going to choose the vulnerability of trusting you over the vulnerability of trusting my own blind spots, right? It allows for the relationships to mature. It allows for the community to be active contributors to the solution. And it creates this opportunity for the kind of intelligence that will allow meaningful, strategic, significant change in how we live and work. On that note, let's pause and we will return. Welcome back. This is, again, Jeremy Del Rio with Thrive Collective and the New York City Leadership Foundation. We're about to begin big idea number 3, overcoming self-deception, getting out of the box. So we've begun by introducing a biblical framework for thinking about systems thinking. We've introduced the importance of a commitment to understanding the big picture and some of the basics of systems thinking. We've talked about the second big idea of collective intelligence and the fact that the search for truth requires the active participation of others. Big idea number 3 now invites us to look deeper at our own contributions to the systems that we participate in, the good, the bad, the ugly, right? We all contribute to the environments that we're part of, the communities, families, relationships that we belong to. And so understanding our own contribution is an important part of authentic leadership. It's also an important part fundamentally in being the kind of different that allows us to affect significant change that's also sustainable. To begin our discussion, I want to introduce you to medical innovator, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, who practiced in Central Europe in the mid-1800s. And he was at the Vienna General Hospital, where he worked primarily as an obstetrician, delivering babies, but he also, as part of his routine medical practice, conducted research on human cadavers, right? Research into different diseases. At the time in Vienna General Hospital, the obstetrician ward had one of the highest rates of infant mortality, really of mortality of any of the patients, but in particular, the babies that were being born in the hospital. And as you might expect, this caused great distress to the patients, to the hospital staff, and in particular to Dr. Semmelweis, who was committed to figuring out why the mortality rates of this group of patients were so disproportionately high, not only at the hospital or in respect to the rest of the hospital, but also to comparative hospitals in the region. And so he began an intense quest to figure out what was causing these higher rates of death among his patients. His research ultimately, began really with no new insight, and he was incredibly frustrated and really tortured by this situation, and then discovered this insight that there might be a connection between the work he was doing with cadavers, the research he was doing with cadavers, and the living patients who were becoming cadavers. And so with this insight in mind, he began what at the time was completely revolutionary, which was the practice of washing his hands in a chemical solution that he then standardized for the rest of the department. And very quickly, as you might expect, the mortality rates reversed. And it went from being, really just this really awful, tragic circumstance to becoming the standard for the rest of the hospital. Unfortunately, his research was not well received at the time, right? This idea that it was the doctor's own unclean hands that were contributing to the death of the patients. It makes sense now. I mean, it's pretty standard practice for us today. But back then, the hospital resisted. The medical establishment of the day resisted. Ultimately, he was forced out of the hospital where he made this discovery. And the rest of his career, it kind of hovered over him like a cloud. Ultimately, he ended up suffering from some pretty extreme mental illness and died in a psychiatric hospital, but totally rejected by his peers, ostracized. And the core of the rejection was their refusal to acknowledge that it was their own unclean hands that were bringing germs into the, these other areas of the hospital and contributing to the infection and ultimate demise of patients. It wasn't long after Semmelweis's discovery and this practice of washing hands that Pasteur discovered germ theory, and it explained the phenomenon that Semmelweis was grieved by, but it also explained why his prescription was so helpful. Today, in front of the very hospital where he made the discovery that ultimately caused him so much public shame and angst, there's a statue of him celebrating his life and his legacy. Metaphorically speaking, this idea of unclean hands is what drives the big idea of discerning what our contributions might be to the system's issues that cause so much pain and hardship around us, right? So the overview, we're going to explore the problem of self-deception, discover how and why it occurs, how it becomes characteristic of us, and also how it impacts other people. Self-deception is not a victimless crime, as it were. When we self-deceive, inevitably other people subsidize that deception. And so we're going to look at how and why that occurs, but then also explore ways to address the problem. For starters, we'll define self-deception as the problem of not knowing that you have a problem, right? It's not always kind of an intentional, willful blindness. Often self-deception is simply not even understanding that there is a problem or that we have a problem, like the doctors that were bringing disease with them to healthy patients in Vienna's hospital where Dr. Semmelweis worked, right? None of them, they were utterly clueless that they were transmitting germs to living patients that ultimately were causing their demise, right? They had no idea that that was true. When he began to push back and make these discoveries, they were resistant to the truth because it was such a foreign concept to them fundamentally. But it's not just this problem of not knowing we have a problem, right? There's often something deeper than the behavior that others can see. Something that, when wrong, undercuts the effectiveness of even the most outwardly right behavior. You know, oftentimes we're doing everything right. Like the doctors who were delivering these babies were following all of the best practices of the time. They were vigilant. Dr. Semmelweis was vigilant about doing everything according to the standards of the day, right? And even going above and beyond those standards whenever possible. The something deeper is that all of those right actions were being undercut by this other thing that they were unaware was even a problem. For many of us, the fundamental cause of our self-deception is seeing others as objects, right? Seeing people, objectifying people for right reasons or wrong reasons, but fundamentally objectifying people. When we see other people as people, we become responsive to their reality, their concerns, their hopes, their needs and fears. They are as real and worthy as I am, right? When we see them as human beings, when we redeposit within them that imago Dei human dignity, right? We respond to their realities. Their realities are as important to us as our own realities. We have a human to interact with. The problem is not when we see other people as humans. The problem is when we see them as objects. We become resistant to their reality. We see them as less than me, less important, less relevant, less real. Seeing them as less than they are, we become deceived about them and also about ourselves, right? The objectifying happens when we perceive others as problems, when we perceive them as challenges, when we perceive them as difficult, when we perceive people not as imago Dei masterpieces handcrafted by the same creator that made myself, right? But when I see them as standing in the way of my vision or my comfort or my desires, even well-intentioned desires for the community that we share. When we see them as an obstacle that needs to be overcome or a problem that needs to be solved, fundamentally we are devaluing their humanity and objectifying their existence. There are two ways to do almost anything. The ways of doing things are not determined by whether our behavior is hard or soft. What matters is whether we are seeing others as people or objects. There are two ways to do hard things, and there are two ways to do soft things. The other people in our life almost always know which way we're being. They know when we're empathizing with their pain and their struggle, and they also know when we're problem solving their existence, right? And their ability to discern that often impacts how they respond to us. And if we're not aware of what we're doing, it can create one of those reinforcing cycles, the vicious cycles that we were talking about earlier. For each of us, it presents us with a choice. As a person, I know what it means to be a person. I know what it means to have a sense of what people need. I know what it means to have, to suffer with pain, to suffer with heartache. My responsiveness to other people's needs is my deepest sense of what is right. When I resist responding to their needs, I betray my deepest sense of what is right. In so doing, I betray myself. In so doing, I sin, right? When I do wrong, I seek to be justified. You know what? I'm not even going to project this on all of you. I'm just going to own it for myself. When I find myself in a pattern of sin, it is very easy for Jeremy the lawyer to emerge and to be defensive and to make the case for why what I'm doing is actually right. Romans 12, verses 14 through 18, present an alternative, but also explain to us what's happening when we choose to rediscover the humanity in somebody else, right? Romans, the same passage we referenced in part 1, that invites us to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, being able to see and think and understand differently, right? Now it's painting a picture for what the different understanding looks like. And the different understanding that it's offering us is one that restores in every person the dignity of being an image bearer of God, right? And says, treat them with the respect that is worthy of the reflection of the Creator, right? Treat them as a person, not as an obstacle to be overcome or an enemy to be defeated, but as a person worthy of that personhood. For all of us, it kind of begs the question, but what if they really are difficult? What if they really are belligerent? What if they really are contributing to my discomfort or pain? What matters most is what I do about my sense to do something for them, right? So even if they are contributing to their mess, do I still see them as a person? And am I responding to them as a person? Or am I seeing them as a cog in the mess machine? For us, how we respond comes with warning signs, right? We don't just have to wait for the response. There are warning signs that our relationship with this person or how we're responding to them might be off, right? One is the horribilizing warning sign. That's this impulse we have that says, I can't believe what they did. What they did is so horrible. It defies anything I could have possibly imagined. Or we blame them. I'm not the one who did such and such. I'm not the one who harmed so and so, right? It's not my fault. It's somebody else's fault. This is a warning sign that we're carrying this self-deception. Feeling victimized in the situation. Well, the situation hurt me. What hurt me was this, right? It's a warning sign. Not that your pain doesn't count or isn't important, but if all we see is our own pain, we're neglecting oftentimes the fact that there are other people also in pain in this situation. Another warning sign is exaggerating values, right? What I won't tolerate is this. We make these grand pronouncements when there's conflict, and yet we forget the pronouncements in our day-to-day life. We judge ourselves by our intentions and everybody else by their actions, right? Don't exaggerate the importance of their actions and overlook their intentions. Knowing I'm right? What I know for sure is blah, blah, blah. I had this expectation, this intention. I didn't do that. I did do this, right? When we're certain that our action was the right action in the moment, then inevitably we're not leaving space for the other person's perspective or their experience. Another warning sign, focusing on myself. What I need out of this, right? My comfort was violated. My desires were overlooked. My preferences were trampled. When we focus on ourselves, we're probably self-deceived. When we're talking about the carry boxes, what do we mean, right? So when we objectify people, is there a pattern in how we see them? When we're in the box, that in the box in this instance means we're literally putting them in a box, and our treatment of them is governed by these boundaries that we put around them. Is there a pattern in how we see these people when we find ourselves in those circumstances? Is there a pattern in how I see myself? And there's somebody in my life right now that I've found myself in a pattern. Every time we interact, it's easy for me to assume a level of passive aggressive treatment from this other party. And I see them now as passive aggressive, whether they're being passive aggressive or not. like in the circumstance. And then I can also discern a pattern of how I begin to engage with the person, because I try to avoid them, I try to ignore them, I try to schedule my time so we limit our interaction. And so there becomes the pattern, not only in how I see that person and the actions that person engages with, but now there's also become this pattern in how I'm viewing myself in relationship to that person. And the patterns have separated us. We're not as close as we used to be. We're not as intentional about collaborating like we used to be. We're not as personally connected. We're not sharing our lives together in the way that we used to, because there's this pattern that has created a wedge between us. What do I see in others that reinforces this box, right? When I'm committed to the box and I see the person interacting, I begin with like this suspicion. And so immediately I'm on high alert. The defenses are activated. And so I start to see and discern and probably misunderstand a lot of the signals, because I've placed the person in the box. And in that space, I react in such a way where I start to mistreat them, right? Because I'm suspicious, I'm judging them, avoiding them, quick to defend myself when they raise important issues that may or may not be passive aggressive, right? And so I begin to mistreat them and make life more difficult for them. Even I stop listening. Like the thing that they're talking about may very well be an important and avoidable problem that I've created for them, but I don't even hear it because I'm too suspicious that what they're saying has an ulterior motive, right? And so I'm not responding to the thing I'm doing that's creating the issue for them in the first place. So they got to deal with the issue, and they got to deal with my suspicion, and they have to deal with the fact that we're not as close as we used to be, and the loss of whatever benefit that might have created for them in the past, right? And so now this relationship that used to be so mutually beneficial in so many ways is becoming harmful to both of us. When I can see in this way, when I'm committed to seeing, it allows me to empathize. What's it like for them when I'm in this box, when I'm in this space of viewing them with suspicion, right? How does it make them less inclined to want to be around me because of how I'm mistreating them? How might I see and treat them differently if I were not in the box? If I could step out of these boundaries and rediscover their humanity, maybe I could see that the issues they're responding to, even if they're responding inappropriately, but those issues are valid. And I have a responsibility to remedy the problems I'm creating, not avoid the problems or the person who's affected by the problems. What does this reveal about the boxes I might carry with me most of the time? In other words, is it just this one person that I have this tendency towards suspicion and avoidance, or are there other people too, right? When do I default to those spaces, and how might they be undermining my effectiveness, not to mention my relationships? How would I complete the sentence? I'm the sort of person who. Take a moment. You could do it now while you pause the video, or you could do it later and complete that. Do you have a default pattern of interacting with people when you are suspicious of their intentions in the way that I just described? When we're honest with ourselves in that way, we discover how often, how easy it is to betray ourselves. When we betray ourselves, we provoke in others the behavior we say we hate, right? If I am mistreating the other party and then they get protective or defensive or frustrated or wounded or traumatized by my mistreatment, then chances are they're going to act in the way that I wanted them not to act in the beginning. And they then provoke it in me, right? This is the definition of one of those vicious cycles. It's insanity when we're committed to this kind of mutuality of self-betrayal. But when others and I betray ourselves towards each other, we provide each other with what we most desire, and that is justification, right? It's easy for me to treat the person poorly when they treat me poorly, right? If I'm treating them suspiciously and that suspicion is kind of this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, now I have all the justification I need to continue treating them in this way. That's collusion. It's the mutual mistreatment that results, right? It's not as important as the mutual self-justification that makes it possible. The mistreatment is the symptom. The cause is the self-deception. It's the self-justification. And without intentionally dealing with that, the mutual mistreatment will continue. In my resistant, alienated way of being, I am unhappy, insecure, and alone, but at least I know I'm justified. When we understand this, what doesn't work is trying to change the other person. It also doesn't work to just try to cope with the other person. Like to stay convinced that the other person is actively committed to passive aggression and making my life miserable, so I'm going to try to cope with it, right? That's not going to solve the problem. It's not going to get me out of my box of self-deception. Leaving the situation doesn't resolve the situation. It just buries it for a time. Chances are, if you're part of a community, that thing that got buried is going to resurface at the least opportune time. That is not the way to resolve the situation. Communicating in a way that's just like talking about the problem, that's not going to solve the problem either. Implementing techniques, not enough. Changing your behavior, not enough, right? Those become Band-Aid solutions. It's the conforming to the pattern of this world kind of approach. That is not going to get me off the self-deception train. The key to getting out of the box, right? Number one, remember that the box is just a metaphor for that particular relationship. So the key to getting out of the box with that person who passive aggressively mistreats me is to take a step back from that relationship and remember I'm in many relationships at the same time. And not all of the relationships I'm in are these in the box kinds of relationships. When I consider the other relationships, the ones that are more responsive rather than reactionary, right? It gives me leverage to get out of the box in the other relationship. What do I mean by that? Well, when I take a step back from that relationship that's right now actively causing me pain, I can think of other relationships, maybe where there was similar pain in the past, but we worked through it. You know, maybe there was a different kind of pain in the past, but we worked through it. And in considering those other relationships, it allows me to recognize the key to working through something, not coping with it or putting a Band-Aid on it. Those other relationships provide out-of-the-box vantage points, right? Perspectives that I can now apply to this situation. They provide places where I can see past my blind spots and see the world with fresh eyes, right? So the blind spot that allows me to become defensive when I feel like I'm under attack. If I'm taking a step back from the place where I felt under attack and think of other places where I was similarly, compromised, but I learned how to deal with my reaction in a healthy way, will give me fresh perspective on dealing with this current situation or the current relationship. In looking for those out of the box vantage points, consider other people with whom you're generally out of the box and currently out of the, right? So where you have a healthier relationship, what makes those relationships healthy? People who've been a major positive influence in your life, and what have they meant to you? Memories of people who've shown you kindness, especially when you didn't deserve it, right? The people who forgave you for the time that you actively mistreated them. The people who showed you mercy even when you deserved judgment or punishment. But not just relationships, but other places or environments in which you're often out of the box. Maybe it's in a particular home, or in a particular neighborhood, or a particular vacation destination, right? Environments that cause you to decompress, that allow for the perspective. Mm-hmm. What is it about those environments, those places, that create enough distance to have fresh eyes? In that moment, right, when you've created the space and you've been intentional about reorienting your perspective on the situation, it allows you to consider the situation anew. With respect to someone or a community of people that you think you're in the box towards, what are the challenges, trials, burdens, and pains this person is dealing with, past and present? Right now, you're in the perspective where you can see the world through their eyes. And if you don't know, you have a conversation point that you can ask and begin to listen instead of judging. In what ways may I have added to those challenges, trials, burdens, and pains? In what ways, large or small, may I have mistreated or neglected the person or people? In light of all of this, right, you've gotten that perspective, you've reflected on things that have worked in other relationships, you've put yourself in the situation of the people that are being impacted by your current behavior. In light of all of this, what do I now have the sense to do for this person or people, right? After I've considered all of that, what's my next move? Is it to apologize? Is it to self-correct an underlying behavior? Is it to acknowledge the impact that behavior has had, and then remedy the negative impacts that it's created, whether with that individual or with the group of people or in the community, right? But how do I restore the situation and remedy the pain that I've contributed to causing? When you consider it, there might be a lot of things that come to mind. You can't do them all at once. Pick the lowest hanging fruit, right? The smallest thing, the first thing that you can commit to changing, and do it as soon as possible. This is part of systemic change, right? It's a self-awareness and a commitment to integrity that forces us or causes us to make the changes that are going to impact others in this way. When I leave the box, when I make those changes, when I seek forgiveness, when I adjust my behavior, I give others a different person to respond to, right? I've changed the circumstances of their lives. They're no longer interacting with the person that's prodding them and poking the bear and triggering their trauma. Now they can respond to a different dynamic. Because I'm giving them a different person to respond to, I'm changing their world, even in this small way. I'm no longer a headache that they have to contend with. Seeing others with compassion, my view of them changes whether they change or not. Even if they never make the change that I hope they'll make, right? I'm changing because my view of them has been restored. Their humanity has been restored. Dr. King provides us with an example. His famous letter from a Birmingham jail. He's saying segregation is bad because it objectifies certain humans, right? The ones being segregated against. We have to put them in boxes in order to justify segregation. And the boxes we put them in are not the boxes that make them human. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. The problem with segregation, the problem with unjust legal systems, the problem with laws and policies that mistreat entire segments of our population, fundamentally it's because we are dehumanizing the people the laws are meant to serve and support, right? And in that dehumanization, we've reduced people to its. We've relegated them to things to be managed, things to be controlled, things to be compartmentalized, and we forget that they're human beings, fully formed, fully handcrafted by their creator for a destiny, and we rob them of that destiny. In order to engage others, there are some lessons and practices not to do, right? If we want to pay it forward to the people we lead, some things to consider. Do not pay it forward by saying to the other party, you really need to read this, or you really need to watch this workshop, or you really need to, do this Google search and change these behaviors. Don't tell them what they really need to learn in the process. If you want to engage them in this learning, the way to invite them into this learning is acknowledge that all you have learned applies to you alone, period. Leave it at you. These are things you've learned. Live it out consistently and acknowledge our missteps. I'm sorry that I've withdrawn, and instead of being withdrawn, how can I serve you and support you in this? Share your story in a humble, honest, out-of-the-box way. You're not sharing the story so you can manipulate their change. I'm sharing the story to become accountable for my change. Share the book with others if they're interested. What book am I talking about? I'll give you the recommendation in just a minute. But in fact, all of this particular set of content is published by the Arbinger Institute. And there's a whole library of resources that they have that unpack it further that I will recommend at the end. Continue to learn how to live with your heart at peace, right? In as much as it depends on you, live at peace with everybody. We live with the heart at peace when we're quick to forgive, when we're quick to apologize, when we stop trying to manipulate a result in other people. We live at peace when we're willing to take a step back and honest self-reflection that causes us to honestly change our own behavior moving forward. Galatians 2 verse 20 captures it, I think, beautifully. I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. This kind of change is the authentic leadership that invites the community to share their insight with us, that invites the community to build a shared vision with us, that invites the community to take the kind of collective action that brings systemic change over the long term. I mentioned the Arbinger Institute. Feel free to check them out online at arbinger.com. The book resource that I referenced is called Anatomy of Peace. It's a phenomenal book. I highly recommend it. That is big idea number 3. We are transitioning now to big idea number 4, right? So as we're moving in this journey, we're seeing differently, we're embracing the commitment to understanding the big picture, and we're engaging others, we're trusting them with our blind spots, we're being vulnerable so that the collective insight can broaden our understanding, so much so that we're choosing to restore the humanity of those around us, even those that we might disagree with or contend with. The leadership is becoming even more authentic because we're dealing with our own self-deception first. We're repenting of our sin, to use that biblical invitation, so that we can be different. Now the journey inward is going to be the springboard back into how we love our neighbors as we've loved ourselves, by allowing the change to happen in our heart. Shared vision is this first step, right? Shared vision, Frederick Buechner, I love this framing. The kind of work God usually calls you to is the kind of work that you need most to do and that the world most needs to have done. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet, right? This recognition that I have a unique place in the world, and the unique set of skills, passions, desires, physicality, geography of my life adds value in very specific ways. But until I'm embedded within the community, right, I will never know fully where and how to add the most value. The opportunity to add the most value comes when what I'm most passionate about is aligned with what the world most needs to have done. That happens because I'm in community and I'm inviting the community to help shape not only my understanding on what's going on, but also my vision for what we want to see transpired. The work we do at Thrive Collective around public art is a great example of this. When we're teaching, when one of our teaching artists is embedded in a school and they have 5 classes and they're working with 150 kids or whatever the number of students is, and the job collectively of all these students in all these classes is to develop one big idea that they want to communicate in a public way through visual arts. They have to define what the message is. When kids, or for that matter, anybody in modern American society comes together, we're so wired to readily identify what differentiates ourselves, right? All the things that make us different from the next person. It takes a lot more work sometimes to figure out what makes us similar. Shared vision is the byproduct of the what makes us similar conversation, right? What do we all agree on? What do we want the world to look like? How do we want the world to be better? What do we want our future to consist of? Whatever the issue, the opportunity is, creating space to do that, and then committing to the process of resolving the inevitable conflicts that emerge and pushing past the tendency to retreat in our own cliques. To say, okay, where's the overlap? Let's find the overlap and let's commit to that. That's what shared vision is. It starts by hearing the call, understanding your mission, and also giving space to others to define theirs as well. So that shared vision is the jointly held image that we create when we're in this communication with other people, in community with other people. But it's a jointly held image of the future we want to create together. So our community currently looks like this. We want the community to look like that. There's a space between this and that. And together, now that we know what that is, we can figure out the path forward. Developing a shared vision begins when every individual who's part of the process can speak their own vision, clarify their own vision, right? When I'm fully operating in my mission, the world looks different. How? Right? That's a picture of your own vision. When the community is comprised of people who can answer that question, now you have an opportunity to find where there's overlap. Shared vision happens when we avoid making vision the exclusive responsibility of the figurehead, right? The person at the top. It's not the CEO's job to be the visionary and everybody falls in line. Shared vision means the CEO is going to facilitate this iterative process with everybody else to work through all the differences and find where the overlap is and then hold us accountable to that thing. Shared vision happens when we continually share our personal vision and encourage others to share theirs. We have to remind ourselves, somebody, why we're committed to this thing, this process, this community. Let's remind ourselves, and not just remind everybody else why I'm doing it, but I need them to remind me why they're doing it so I can serve and support that thing that they long to see in our community. Shared vision happens when we realize that being a visionary leader is about solving day-to-day problems with your vision in mind, right? In other words, right now I have an urgency. It snuck up on me and it's hijacked my day. I've got to deal with that urgency. If I'm going to deal with the urgency and not compromise the shared vision, I have to remember, maybe I have to take a beat, a pause, before diving in and contributing my, intensity to that urgency, right? I need to slow down long enough to remember, okay, this is the big goal, the end goal. Now let me come back and try to resolve it in relationship to that larger vision. I need to accept that it takes time because shared vision grows as a byproduct of individual visions. The shared vision that we're working towards together is not achievable in my time frame. Trusting the process means I have to communicate with the rest of the people that are part of this, right? And when things change, I need to give them the update. I need to invite their insight on the change too. Shared vision allows multiple visions to exist, right? It doesn't dictate how everybody sees all facets of the world. It's not requiring lockstep, sameness across a community, but it is saying that your vision and my vision overlap in these key respects. And so as it relates to those things, let's work together. That's what shared vision looks like. When we commit to that process, now we have the foundation for big idea number 5. Creating healthy change, enacting that future together. That shared vision becomes attainable because it's not just dependent on me. It's not just dependent on you, but together we can do our respective parts to manifest that future dream. Before we wrap up with big idea number 5, just a reminder, we are now on the outward part of this journey where we've allowed this commitment to seeing the big picture transform us, deal with our own self-deception. So much so that we've invited other people into this process. Together, we've developed a shared vision. Now it's time for collective action that produces strategic change. We know when collective action is not happening because there's misalignment, right? When there's misalignment, it means that everything's pulling in different directions. The wheels are misaligned, right? And it causes the car to swerve and to not follow the path that needs to be followed if we're not actively overcompensating for the misalignment. So we need an adjustment. What does alignment look like? Alignment in a community collective way means we're swimming in the same direction. We're working towards the same goal. It's not every man, woman for themselves, right? I'm just out to get mine. I'm pursuing my own thing. When we start to deviate in that way, there's misalignment. And we need to course correct, or else this vision is not going to be manifested. If we don't course correct, it's going to be a lot easier for everybody else to begin to look out for their own interests and not the interests of the whole. When that starts to happen, either the direction's going to shift, it's going to fall off track, right? But ultimately, we're not aiming towards the same target that we set out to achieve. And so we need the discipline, right, of defining the vision and then staying accountable to that vision. Assessing alignment means, number one, we've clearly defined the shared vision. If we haven't clearly defined it, if we haven't clearly stated it, then we're not going to achieve it, right? But it's not just about stating it, it's, does everybody agree? If we're not careful, the person who's the most eloquent is going to end up interpreting everybody's vision, and then everybody may or may not agree with that interpretation. So do the members reflect their commitment and contribution to fulfilling it? How do you know? Well, their actions are going to speak volumes, right? If we've all said we're going to do X, but 6 months later, we do X part of the time, but we also do Y and we do Z, right? We're going to find ourselves being pulled in other directions. And the actions are going to speak a lot more loudly than, the initial yay or nay that might have come. Another way to assess alignment is in expectations. Does the group have clearly stated expectations in terms of roles, deliverables, and plans, right? Sometimes we clarify the target, but we don't build back from the target to clearly define our roles, deliverables, and plans. Do the member actions reflect their capacity, commitment, and effectiveness in meeting them, right? When we don't clearly define those expectations, when they're fuzzy, and we have this general sense of where we want to go, but we have this fuzzy set of pathways to get there, the actions are betraying the lack of alignment, right? They're revealing whether it's capacity limitations or commitment limitations or just general effectiveness, but it's going to show what's really going on and not just what we say we want to see happen. Assessing alignment also require us to evaluate the way that we're working, right? So not just are the roles clear and the expectations defined, the vision defined, but do we have clearly established values and standards that guide how we work together, how we make decisions, how we solve problems? If that's not clarified, then collective action is not going to be sustainable. Also, are the members willing to be bound by those, right? This ultimately is a covenant that we all say yes to, or it's not going to happen. Specifically, do their actions demonstrate that they care deeply for the people they serve, right? If the actions are still about objectifying the people, this is not going to last. Is it about contributing to the success of their partners, right? The other's success has to be more important than my own if collective action is going to have a chance of succeeding. Helping the team members learn and grow has to be fundamental to this process. How am I making my team more successful? Am I supporting their growth and their learning? And am I willing to be accountable and transparent with our supervisors, right? Am I in the process of being transparent, or am I hiding? Am I avoiding responsibility for when I know I messed up? Building and sustaining alignment requires us to recognize our interdependence. The group is comprised of many members, like that body says, right? The pinky toe is interdependent on the nervous system, working in full effect in order for me to be able to treat it and have that toe healed, right? It's also about empowerment. There's this interdependence that happens, but I acknowledge the interdependence by empowering others to succeed, supporting others, within the group. How can I ensure that all the members are free to share equally in creating and contributing to this shared vision, right? Am I taking the time to listen? Am I creating the conversations where people can speak in based on their contribution? Are we adjusting our path? Are we modifying our shared expectations? Are we reestablishing accountability and being willing to hold ourselves accountable? How can I support the rest of the team in their efforts and avoid the power struggles? And that becomes, of course, a function of accountability. Is there a high degree of voluntary, genuine accountability? As the leader, I need to model it, right? Putting it out there, here's what's going on. I'm going to take the lumps for all my missteps, right? And I'm going to ask you to share in not only exposing my blind spots, but building the safeguards to avoid that in the future. And can we do it in an honest way that's constructive and avoids blame? It's not about blame. It's about mutual benefit and growth for the community, for the collective. Getting there requires this commitment, but a way to operationalize it is called the pilot group model of change, right? We have this vision for personal results. Each individual that's part of the shared vision, right? Joe wants to see X, Y, and Z in his family. That commitment to personal results provides a certain level of enthusiasm and willingness to commit. I know that I'll get closer to X, Y, and Z if I have the support of other people. So now, based on that willingness to commit and that enthusiasm, there's an investment in learning and change. That investment results in actual learning, right? We start doing things differently. We're learning new ways of doing, new ways of being, new ways of practice, and it produces more results, right? This personal cycle starts to unfold. That investment in learning and change, though, doesn't just result in my own learning, but there's a growing interest in the people who know me because they're starting to see the results. They're getting inspired or at least curious. And so my learning is starting to be shared in my own network of relationships. There's a diffusion of understanding taking place, which results in other people's enthusiasm and willingness to commit. This group investment now in learning and change results in a new set of practices that don't just impact me and my personal life, but they start to reproduce in other people. Right? This is a pilot. What's happening? My life was a pilot, and now it's starting to impact others. And then our shared experience is a new level of piloting that starts to inspire other people. And we see this replication that allows for shared ownership, right? It grows my credibility, but it also allows for shared ownership, which results in even more enthusiasm and willingness to commit. This is the pilot model of change. We want significant strategic change that's going to result from collective action. This is how we get there, right? I'm more of an authentic leader because I've done the self-reflection. I'm overcoming self-deception. I'm engaging people differently. I'm inviting their critique. We're developing this shared vision, and we're starting to learn and grow together. We're taking collective action. Now it begins to spread. In that process, in the larger community, we see that some people are the make it happen people. They're the early adopters, right? Those are your pilot change agents. Within the organization or within the neighborhood or within the city that you're operating in, not everybody's going to embrace the change immediately. And the beautiful thing is they don't need to do it immediately. Jesus started with 12 disciples, not 12 million disciples, right? But you find that core group that's willing to commit to this level of accountability, empowerment, and interdependence and make it happen. Make the change real, demonstrable, experiential, right? And then all the other people that may not have been the early adopters, they see the change, they taste it, they know it's good, they want more of it. Now they start to help it happen for a wider audience. They engage the make it happen crowd. They're helping it to spread. And then as more and more people are undertaking it, as the change is effectively growing its visibility, its credibility in the neighborhood, all the watch it happen people, the ones who stood back a little bit, they were non-committal at first. They were the wait and see if this is going to last crowd. They start to get on board. And the more of them get on board, then the hold it back folks, the ones that were like, I'm just not sure, they were more committed to tradition. Now it becomes unavoidable and they start to press in. There'll always be a small subset of your community that's the over my dead body crowd. Don't waste your energy casting pearls to those swine, right? Let them do their thing. You don't need them to see the community change when you're committed to this consistent application of shared vision and collective action. As you press forward with that pilot, remember your after action review. What did you set out to do? What actually happened? Why did the actual results differ from your intentions? What can you learn that can help you in the future? And then let those learnings inform the ongoing evolution of the shared vision. How can we move forward together? What must we do to bring that vision to life? That level of commitment results in the kind of systemic change that we hope to see in this world. Another resource I want to recommend, Knowledge Cafe, is a resource that talks about how you facilitate these kinds of conversations. How can we collectively learn our way into the future, right? In that, just Google Knowledge Cafe. There's all kinds of forms and case studies of how to facilitate these types of discussions with your core constituencies. But ultimately, as a group, you're answering, how do we want to redefine our shared vision, right? We're learning, we're growing, we live on the same block, we're committed to the same community. What do we want to see happen in our future that we're sharing? What have we learned today that can help us work more effectively together, right? The things that we're seeing, that we're doing, that we're participating in, what are the lessons that result in immediate actionable steps? What should our pilot group focus on who should be involved, and what support will they need, right? The pilot's not going to solve every problem, every layer of every problem, every nuance, every particularity, right? But the pilot allows for a taste and see that this is good moment. And the more of those moments we have, the more possibility we have of clarifying the expectations, the vision, and the path forward. For each of those high priority goals, make a choice, right? If you could have it right now, would you take it? If you had it right now, what would it bring you? If you had it right now, what would it cost you? And knowing all of this, are you ready to choose it, right? You define those high priority goals. You can't do all of them at once. And so these questions help you discern which is the right priority for right now, right? And if you can, if again, you pick that lowest hanging fruit, create a win, create an experience that will allow for more self-reflection. TheWorldCafe.com is another resource like Arbinger that provides reference and case studies to help model it for your own context. So we've been on this journey. Again, I invite you to revisit your expectations from the front end, but our journey allows us to see differently. That sight allows us to make the adjustments, right? The sight is a commitment to the big picture, understanding the component parts, how they relate to each other, digging deeper with collective insight, recognizing that my brain power and emotional intelligence is not enough. I need to trust others if I want a systems understanding of what's going on that's impacting my community. Authentic leadership means that I'm willing to recognize my own unclean hands, right? Recognize the contributions I'm making to the dysfunction. And am I willing to deal with that before I expect it of other people? When I'm at that place, I'm being transformed. I'm becoming a different leader, willing and able to develop a shared vision with others, the kind of shared vision that allows for the collective action that produces the strategic change, that allows for a sustainably different set of actions, right? The kind of actions that over the long run are going to produce the future that we've imagined together. Thank you very much for participating in this workshop. Again, my name is Jeremy Del Rio. You can find me online at thrivecollective.org, on social media at Jeremy R. Del Rio on Instagram and Jeremy Del Rio on Twitter and Facebook. And I look forward to staying connected. God bless you all.